All right, so at this point, we've talked about sort of the electrical events that happen in a muscle fiber and how a muscle fiber contracts. But of course, in your body, you pretty much never have just one muscle fiber contracting. In order to produce force, to produce energy, to do pretty much anything, you've got to have a whole bunch of muscle fibers contracting. And that gets a little bit more complicated than just one. It isn't like in a muscle, either all of the muscle fibers are contracting or none of them are. There's actually a bunch of in between states that are more normal. So that's what we're going to talk about today is the behavior of whole muscles as they go through a contraction cycle. So here are some terms. We've talked a little bit about some of these and less about others. This is relevant to a muscle fiber right now. So here we're talking about a single fiber. This is a contraction in a muscle fiber, right? And here we're looking at the contraction, not the action potential. So you see as you're proceeding down in time here, this is where the voltage threshold is met. Remember, this is what we talked about before, where you have to you have to get you have to allow enough sodium in through the ligand-gated ion channels that you pass a threshold voltage, and then that's what's going to cause the voltage-gated ion channels to begin opening up, causing an action potential. Well, here is where that threshold is met. Note that the muscle does not begin to contract immediately. There is a short latent period. The latent period is the time between stimulus and contraction. And that makes sense if you think about it, because you've got to have your action potential spread out from the synapse and down the T tubules, and then have your DHP receptors stimulate ryanodine and then release calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which then has to diffuse through the cell and bind to troponin, and then you can finally start to get your myosin head groups actually actively engaged in contracting your muscle, right? Now, all that stuff takes time. It doesn't happen instantly, and this isn't like a computer or something like that where you've got everything happening at the speed of light. This is happening at the speed of chemicals diffusing, which is, fast over short distances, which is what we're talking about, but it's not instant. So you have this short latent period in between when the muscle is activated and when it starts to contract. At this point, we're assuming that the muscle is only stimulated once. It goes through a contraction phase where it's shortening. This is the time period in which the calcium is out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then you have the relaxation phase. This is where you are pumping the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the cell gradually stops contracting. This whole cycle from the initial time of stimulation to the time when the muscle has returned to its original length is called a twitch. And some muscles twitch fast and some twitch slower. And you've probably heard about fast twitch and slow twitch muscles, and this is what it means. So some muscles are going to contract for a longer period of time and then take a longer time to reset before they can twitch again. Some are going to twitch very quickly and then relax very quickly. and some are going to be intermediate. So for skeletal muscle, the twitch duration, this whole thing from stimulus to muscle returning to its original size, can be between 7 and 100 milliseconds. So a millisecond is 1,000th of a second. So, like even the longest twitch is only like 1/10 of a second. And that's not very long from the way we think of things, but from the way your body thinks of things, that's a long time. When your body stimulates muscles, what you have is basically, let's say that you have, I'm going to draw some muscle fibers here in red, all right? Let's say that this is a muscle fiber with its nuclei here. And you have another muscle fiber up here. Another muscle fiber up here. All right. So you got a bunch of muscle fibers all in a bundle. And they've all got contractile proteins inside of them. These don't always contract all together. So you might have one nerve or nerve axon that's going to come down here, and it's going to put off an axon that ends here, and another axon that ends here. And then you might have a different nerve that comes down and has an axon termini right here and here. And so in this little representation that we have here, we have two motor units. Motor unit. That is an important term. A motor unit is basically all of the fibers that are activated by a single neuron. So this blue neuron here, this is one neuron, right? It's got two what are called cotermini. So this would be the main axon, and this would be a collateral axon. But when an impulse travels down this nerve, it's going to travel to all of the axon termini. You can't really change that, right? It's an all or nothing thing. It's going to stimulate all of its cotermini at once. There is actually a way to shut it down, but we're not going to get into that at the moment. For our purposes here, like all of the termini are going to activate at once. So if your brain sends a signal down this blue fiber here, then you're going to get contraction here and here. If your brain sends a signal down the black axon, you're going to get contraction here and here. All right? Both of those motor units are two muscle fibers. Now, in your body, two muscle fibers is probably not going to be the size of any motor unit. Some neurons will have, smaller motor units with things like, maybe 5 or 10 muscle fibers that they're stimulating, and some will be much larger with potentially hundreds of muscle fibers that are stimulated by one neuron that just has a whole bunch of collaterals at the end. The more motor units that one neuron controls, that's going to produce stronger coordinated muscle action, but it's not going to be very subtle. It'll be like I'm putting forth very little brain energy and I'm controlling a large section of muscle. This is going to be for stuff that is not fine control, but is like power, right? On the other hand, you might have some nerves that only control a few fibers, like 5 or 10. And they are going to be a lot more subtle. And they can, like, rather than just having 2 settings, like, off or, max, they will have a whole bunch of settings where what you can do is have higher voltages, right? So you have higher voltages coming down the neuron are going to excite more nerve fibers, and that will stimulate more motor neurons to contract. So the more motor neurons that you bring in, the stronger the muscle contracts. So now instead of just having off and turbo, you've got like a whole rheostat with like from numbers from 0 to 10. And now you can control the strength of the muscle a whole lot better. So up here you see this is a nerve. Now, this is important to keep in mind. We haven't talked about this yet. But just like when you think of a muscle, it's not just one unit that contracts all by itself. It's got a whole bunch of muscle fibers inside of it. When we talk about a nerve, it's not just one wire. Every nerve doesn't have like just one signal that travels down it. A nerve is a bundle of hundreds or thousands of neurons, each of which can be activated individually. So here, this nerve doesn't have any neurons active. This nerve doesn't have any neurons active. Here, we've just reached our threshold. We've got one neuron active here. It's bringing in one motor unit. Maybe 10 fibers are contracting. 10 fibers contracting, not a whole lot of force being made. Now, up here, we've got, 4 of our neurons are firing off. And so we are recruiting 4 motor units, and we are producing a much stronger contraction. Once you get here, all right, all of the neurons are firing, and they're recruiting all of the motor units that they can, producing maximum contraction. It's actually pretty uncommon for maximum contraction to ever be reached. We'll talk about fatigue in a bit, but one of the things that is sort of automatically done by your body and your muscles is you'll bring in, maybe you have, just say you have 100 motor units in a muscle, right? You're probably not going to activate all 100 motor units at the same time. You would bring on, even if you're really working that muscle, you might bring on 70 motor units. And then some of those motor units are going to get fatigued and they will rotate out. And then so 30 of them will get fatigued and rotate out. And then you'll bring in your 30 that you haven't used yet. And then allow those fatigued units to rest. And then, some of your other fibers will get fatigued and they'll fall out, and the ones that were just rested will come back in, and then those first 30 that came in your second wave, they're going to start getting fatigued. So you just sort of keep things on rotation, sort of like you wouldn't want to have a basketball team that just had 5 people in it. Theoretically, there's only ever 5 people on the court at once, but you don't just have 5 people, because you're going to get tired. You got to bring the tired ones off, and you put on your second line players or anything like that. And you just people work that way, muscles work that way. But it's not exactly like basketball, because basketball you can only ever put 5 people out there at one time. With your muscles, if you really need to, if you get a high enough voltage coming down that nerve, you can activate all of those motor units at once, briefly, because they're going to get fatigued, and then they're going to fall out. But you can put forth that maximal effort for some amount of time. And in general, you'll note here that there's an increasing force. You have different size motor units, right? So some motor units might control 5 or 10 fibers. Some might control hundreds of fibers. The first ones that are activated, the ones that are activated to the weakest stimuli, are the smallest motor units that produce the smallest amount of fine motor force. And then as you keep upping the voltage, so like maybe this brings on a motor unit that controls 10 fibers, and then maybe this brings on another motor unit that does 10 fibers. So now you got 20 fibers active. And then you increase the voltage more, and now you're bringing on a motor unit that has 50 fibers. So suddenly you've gone from 20 fibers active to 70 fibers active. And then the next one might actually bring on 500 fibers. So you get an increasing response the more effort you put into the nerve. And by effort you put into the nerve, I mean your brain activating more neurons in that nerve. So lower voltages recruit fewer motor units. Remember, each motor unit controls a set of fibers. Stronger voltages recruit larger motor units, which are going to control a much larger set of fibers. Nerves don't go on and stay on. Just like muscle cells, the action potential of a neuron is like a blip. If you have a long enough time between those blips, then you have time for the muscle to twitch, return back, before it twitches again. However, you can stimulate a muscle faster than it can twitch. Most muscles. Cardiac muscle is actually an exception to this rule. But for skeletal muscle, for the most part, you can stimulate action potentials down that muscle faster than it can twitch. So here what we see is you stimulate a contraction, a twitch, but before it finishes its twitch, you're stimulating another twitch, and that means it's going to contract a little bit harder, and then you stimulate another twitch before it gets back down to the 0 point. And so over time, the average muscle contraction force keeps moving up. This is called a tetanus. In this case, this is a incomplete tetanus. That means that you haven't reached maximal contraction strength all the time. If you're sending in stimuli really, really, really fast, then you very, very quickly reach a state of fused or complete tetanus, where basically all of your motor units are contracting all of the time. And when that happens, you're putting forth maximum effort. And you will do that until your muscles fatigue, which, depending upon the type of muscle they are, will probably be pretty fast. Fused tetanus doesn't happen in your body very frequently. It can happen in the presence of certain toxins, neurotoxins, tetanus toxins, sarin nerve gas, that sort of thing. And it can happen under certain extreme circumstances with some muscles, when you're like powerlifting or something like that. But most people have a very hard time doing it. Your body doesn't want to do it because it's actually kind of dangerous for your body to do, because you'll burn out that muscle, and you can put forth one good pull, but then your muscle's spent for at least a little bit. So when your muscle is contracting, I'm going to say contracting in like air quotes, even though you can't see them. I'll put a little air quotes around contraction up here, because we think of contraction as meaning shortening. But when your muscle is contracting, it isn't always shortening. It's under tension. It's trying to shorten. But that doesn't mean it's succeeding at shortening. Remember, you've got your muscle fibers that are pulling away at this, rope, having a tug of war. Well, you don't always win the tug of war. So we have words for different types of contraction based on how things are or aren't moving. And our first is isometric contraction. This is where you're straining against something, you're producing tension, but you are not actually shortening the muscle, right? Let's say there's this huge big box. It's really, really, really heavy. You bend down, you try to lift it up, and it is not budging, even though you're straining against it. That is isometric contraction. There are times when isometric contraction is even the goal. Stand up on one foot in like a nice little yoga pose, right? You're straining. Ask anyone who's tried to do it. It's hard, but your muscles aren't actually moving. They're pulling against each other perfectly to create joint stabilization. Now that still takes effort, even though there's no motion occurring. Isotonic muscle contraction is muscle contraction that does produce movement. Now, there's two ways that movement can be produced. One is the muscle shortens. That means that's actually contraction. So you see this girl here. She is using her bicep, and it is, she's putting forth enough effort that it's shortening, and it is causing this weight to lift. But after you finish your curl, you got to go back down. That means that in this picture, she's putting forth less force, although still a fair amount of force with that bicep, and also engaging some force in her tricep to control the movement of this downwards. She hasn't just dropped it. She's still contracting her muscle, or tensioning her muscle, to have it go down in a controlled way, but the muscle, even though it's under tension, is lengthening. This state over here is isotonic concentric contraction. Isotonic, meaning that the muscle is moving. Concentric, meaning that the direction of muscle movement is in the direction of the tension. Over here we have isotonic eccentric contraction, meaning that there is movement, the muscle is moving, but the movement of the muscle is against the direction of tension. Whenever you're trying to use your muscle, you go through an isometric and an isotonic phase. You start off engaging like the smallest of your motor units, right? That's probably insufficient to move almost anything in your body, right? You're trying to lift your arm, even if you don't have a weight in your arm, like engaging just 10 motor unit or just 10 muscle fibers isn't even going to be enough to move the weight of your bone. So you have to increase the amount of voltage that you're sending down to your arm, engaging more and more and more motor units, creating more and more and more tension. That is the isometric phase. When the number of motor units that you're engaging rises high enough that you're producing enough force that your muscle actually starts to move and your arm moves with it, then you go into the isotonic phase. At this point, the amount of tension that you are exerting does not change, but instead the muscle length starts to change. So you don't have to pull any harder because now the thing is moving. But as you pull harder, it moves faster. So to summarize, you should know and understand the terms threshold, twitch, and latent period. And if I'm talking about them, you should know what they are. You should also be able to recognize and define them in the form of a question. So like if I say, during a muscle twitch, this is the time between when an action potential starts and when muscle fiber contraction starts. That would be the latent period. You need to understand how motor unit recruitment plays a role in muscle strength, right? The more motor units that you recruit, the stronger the force of contraction of your muscle, and that the stronger a signal you send down your nerve, the more motor units you recruit, starting from the smallest motor units and then working up to larger ones. You need to know what a tetanus is and the difference between incomplete and fused tetanus. And you should be able to understand and distinguish the terms isometric contraction, isotonic contraction, and for isotonic contraction, concentric versus eccentric isotonic contraction.